What's up, y'all? KRC Pinto here. Today, I'm hanging out with Eli Horowitz. He is the author of the FGC novel Bodied, which is an amazing book. If you haven't checked it out, please do. Today, we're going to talk about the book, a little bit about Eli's process, and the thoughts that went into writing the novel. Eli, how's it going today, man?
I'm fantastic. I am inside my house, and boy, do I love being inside my house. I have developed Stockholm syndrome with my own living space, and it feels great. How are you?
Dude, I'm doing great. Doing great. I'm in
Yeah,
the same
good.
position in the apartment, chilling,
Yeah, yeah.
looking at
Yep.
these
Looking at the
these old
same four
screens.
walls.
So you
Go for it.
recently wrote and released this book, Bodied, dude. How have you felt since it came out?
I mean, actually, since it came out, it's been a little bit of an up and down. Um, my wife and I had planned to take it to an event called Michigan Masters, which, as you may guess, would have been in Michigan. Um, Michigan Masters is like, or was, I guess I should say, since COVID happened, and now they've sort of said that they're not doing the event anymore. But was like a super community driven event. It wasn't like on anyone's um, you know, super official pro tour or anything like that. I think they might have had one, maybe like Guilty Gear or something crazy like that. Had some sort of sponsorship, but mostly it was like a really community driven thing. Obviously, the Michigan scene is not thought of as being um, like one of the major like keystone scenes of the US. It's not, your Southern California or your New York or your Chicago or your Texas. Um, but like it's relatively close to where we live in Pittsburgh, and we were like, let's just go do this community thing. I wanted to bring the book over there. I wanted to meet up with a lot of the people who I had met over FGC Twitter. I was going to meet up with like Sriracha Flash and a bunch of other folks. And then obviously COVID happened and the event got canceled. And like I said, that they say that they are not holding it again in the future, which is really sad.
That's a shame.
Um, yeah, and not to, make it all about myself, but that also meant that like all of the plans that I'd had in place for trying to like market the book were out the window. So it's been an up and down. I mean, I'm really happy that the book has received a lot of positive feedback from the people who've read it. That's really rewarding. Um, and I hope that people continue to sort of spread the word. I do plan on taking it out to whichever tournaments happen at some point in the future, assuming that any tournaments happen at some point in the future. Um, because really the goal is just to get it out there and try to share the experience with people. So, like I said, it's been a little bit of an up and down. It's been hard to it's been sort of tough to manage the marketing on top of being in the middle of a pandemic, on top of having a full-time job, on top of having a third novel that I'm trying to write, and so on and so forth. But the thing that really makes it all worthwhile is again to hear people have that positive feedback for it, and to say that it feels authentic and that it feels like what a book about the FGC should feel like.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job from what I could tell of kind of towing the line between writing a book that's both for the FGC and then also about it for
Mm-hmm.
someone who might not be like
Mm-hmm.
fully
Mm-hmm.
introduced to it. And that's a lot of what the questions I have for
Yep.
you today are about. So
Yeah. Yeah.
first one up, pretty straightforward. So the main character, Maya, she starts off as a Marvel junkie who's
Mm-hmm.
hanging out in an arcade called
Yep.
2 Up, which is based in New
Yeah.
York City.
Yep.
Did you have like a certain arcade in mind when you were coming up with that setting? Because you go through like a lot of the details that apply to a lot of arcades, like the glowing lights
Yeah.
everywhere, like the noises,
Sure.
yeah, all the things people
Yeah.
love about it. But like, where were you
Yeah.
when you were writing that setting? Where were you thinking of?
Sure. So the in some ways, but not in all ways, it was based on Next Level in New York City, which is the place that has sort of been the genesis of like the Team Spooky is out of there. NYC Furby, obviously, that's like his main streaming venue. Um, IDOM, the most recent Capcom Cup champion, is from there. They have a very strong fighters scene, et cetera, and so forth. But like, so one of the things that you mentioned earlier, I think before we started, was that it wasn't a book about Daigo, Bodied, and that was one of the things that I very early on in writing it, I discovered that I really couldn't have like, and this is going to be the Daigo character, and this is going to be the spooky character, and this is going to be the XYZ character. In the same way, I discovered that I really couldn't make Two Up like a direct translation of what Next Level is like. First and foremost, because I haven't been there, and that was the same reason, or the same like fundamental idea of why I didn't want to try to put like Spooky or Daigo or whoever in the book, because I haven't met them, and I felt like it would be sort of a dick move on my part to be like, well, here's your public persona, which is probably like 2% of who you are as an individual human, and I'm just going to try to extrapolate from that 2% and make you like recognizable as a caricature of yourself, but not really who you actually are. So that was sort of the process that I went through as I was developing characters. I was like, no, this just feels inauthentic and shitty, and I'm not going to do that to people. And for the same reason, I didn't want to act as though Two Up was sort of like a real replacement for Next Level. There are some minor details that are similar, like the color of the wall, I think, is like, watched videos, where they show the inside of Next Level, and they've got like the red paint on the wall. There is actually, I saw a documentary about I think the New York fighting game scene at a local pinball convention of all things here in Pittsburgh. And they did interview a guy who worked there who had been homeless before he started working at Next Level. And so there's a very, very minor side character who appears for like 2 pages, who likewise was homeless before he started working at Two Up in the book. But like, aside from those itty bitty little details to try to make it seem more fully fleshed out, it's really just like an arcade. I mean, like you said, it's like every arcade has the flashing lights, every arcade has the noise, every arcade these days at least has like, consoles instead of cabinets for them for the most part. So yeah, and it's the same thing with there's a tournament later on set in New Jersey, where I also have like a relatively robust description of what the tournament is like. It's the same thing there. Like that wasn't based on any specific tournament. Again, I haven't. So this is undermining my own credibility as an author or a member of the FGC, but I haven't actually been to any FGC events ever.
Never?
Yeah, no, not once. Like I said, I went to that pinball thing here in Pittsburgh, and I've been to our anime convention a couple of times. And so the descriptions of that tournament were like, visually, the descriptions of that tournament were based on what I've observed watching streams, and then like emotionally or psychologically or sort of atmospherically, the descriptions of that tournament were based on my experiences going to this pinball thing and the anime convention. I figured it was probably close enough.
Well,
And apparently it was.
to give you some confidence there, I've been to a couple CEOs, I've been to Paragon, and I've been to a few Dream Hacks, and I think you nailed it. Like, that's the first thing that popped into my head was CEO. It's like, while I was reading, I was like, oh, I'm at CEO again. Like, that's nice. What this is.
Yeah, so good.
So there you go.
So yeah, I mean, like you said, the intent was to sort of like bury some things in there for people who knew where to dig, who were in the FGC. But like, if you didn't know where to dig, I didn't want all that stuff to be cluttering up your view of the landscape, so to speak. So other than that, it was like, I wanted the apartment that the guys share to be just like an apartment that people could hopefully recognize as an apartment. The arcade was just an arcade that you could recognize as an arcade. The tournament was just a tournament that you could recognize as a tournament. It's all supposed to be like generic enough that it rings a lot of bells, but also with enough details in it that you can sort of immerse yourself. That was really the goal.
You mentioned that you didn't want to do a character that was based around Daigo as like a primary character. But I did notice
Yeah,
that early on in the book, someone shows Maya as like motivation. This clip that's Lee
yeah, yeah,
Edwards versus Four, right? So
yeah, 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 yeah,
Four
yeah.
is our like quiet player who's super methodical, and
Yes,
he's playing with the broken
yeah,
joystick, and that's kind of where the
yeah, yeah,
clip
yeah.
goes. And it's supposed to be like this
Right.
big legendary moment in universe. So
Yep.
like this is your moment 37, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is
Yeah.
right. That's the quasi moment for sure. Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
did you think like having a moment 37, like obviously in real life, real FGC, everyone watches that clip. Everyone's seen it.
Yep.
Everyone wants their own moment 37. Did you think it was like
Yeah.
crucial to give your characters a similar like legend to like inspire them to play harder? Is that like kind of the point of rolling that into there?
So yeah, that did a lot of things. So uh, on one level, right, the book is really about history and sort of how to conceptualize and understand what history means for you personally. So one of the things that I do with that, or one of the things that that little vignette allowed me to do, was to bring another perspective on the history of the FGC itself. So one of the things that the book does is it's set around 2011 into 2012. Which, as people probably know, but I'll say it anyway, was sort of a pivotal era for the FGC in terms of a lot of streaming was just getting up and running. Excuse me. The scene as a whole was growing in terms of numbers because Marvel and Street Fighter, for the most part, were really popular and were attracting both newcomers and people who had sort of dropped out of the scene earlier. Um, and as a result of the numbers increasing, there is this thought that maybe the scene would become more, for lack of a better word, esports, that would become more professionalized, that would become more economically developed. Excuse me. So one of the things that I wanted to do in general with the book was explore that moment of historical transition from a scene that was completely community based and had really no corporate support and no concept or ideals of one day becoming like a profession or a job, into the scene that we have today, where there's pro tours and there's professional commentators, even, and tournament organizers and streamers and stuff. So given that background, one of the things that I wanted to do with the quasi moment 37 was take it back to an even earlier day in the FGC and say, like, here's another historical moment. Here's what history looks like several years ago. And then, like, hopefully that moment combined with a few other moments in the book are enough to get people sort of thinking about history and sort of the path or momentum of history. So that was one thing that I wanted to do at that moment. The other one is, or another one I should say, is that I wanted to set up, or really, if I hadn't set it up by then, at least like, or rather, if I had set it up by then already, I wanted to reinforce this hierarchy between East Coast, West Coast, Japan, because that's still largely operative today. But at the time, again, in 2011 into 2012, there was like a really hardcore dichotomy between the level of play for most games in the United States and the level of play for most games in Japan, especially Street Fighter, which is where the book ends up going into. It was night and day. There were lots of theories about why this was, but the fact of the matter was that if you were a U.S. player at the time in Street Fighter, it didn't, and you want to take yourself seriously, you measured yourself against competitors largely from Japan, also from South Korea and China, and a few other places. And so one of the things that that story allowed me to do was, especially for people who weren't familiar with the FGC, to say, like, hey, here's the level of the gap between Japan and everyone else. Presumably those who are in the FGC already know about that, but like you were saying, for people who didn't know about that, I needed some way of communicating that information. And then finally, like you were saying about giving people something to look up to, or giving the people in the book something to strive for, one of the main questions for the plot of the book is like, what should we be striving for? Um, and as Maya develops as a player and as a person, she goes through these different stages of like, should I be focusing on technical stuff? Should I be focusing on trying to get a read or trying to impose my will on somebody? Is it just like a matter of, you do your best and then you let the chips fall where they may? And ultimately, where I wanted to end up is that there's this really fascinating dynamic in fighting games where you have an opportunity um, to get to know your opponent and to tailor yourself to your opponent in a way that doesn't come up in a lot of other pursuits. So there's something that's not only is there something that's really like captivating about that dynamic, just in terms of watching the competition and being excited for one player or another in a sort of like fan sense. That dynamic, I think, is also really key to people's sort of emotional maturity in general, and specifically with respect to the way that people respond or grapple with their historical circumstances. So I really wanted that moment with Four and Lee Edwards, who's obviously his name is based off of Eddie Lee, who's the New York guy. Okay, just making sure. That moment helps to motivate Maya's path towards the sort of epiphany of where she ends up in the end, which is ideally where I want the reader to end up as well in terms of thinking about their own place and time.
So, book starts off as a Marvel vs. Capcom book. She's all about Marvel vs.
Yes.
Capcom. She grows to,
Yep.
over time, love the Street Fighter series. Is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
how you feel? Are you a Street Fighter guy or a Marvel guy? Do you have a preference? I'm gonna guess Street
Yeah,
Fighter
yeah,
based
yeah.
on the book, but I wanted to ask, do my
Well,
due
so
diligence here.
yeah. So that part actually was actually sort of taken from my own life. I did so my personal fighting game history, like I played Street Fighter 2 back in the day. I have a distinct memory of being on a field trip with my class in elementary school, like probably fourth grade or so, at like a park, a public park in the city of Pittsburgh somewhere where you could like roller skate or something. That like rented roller skates out. So, when they have a skating place, there's always like an arcade, off to the side somewhere. So, we were playing Street Fighter at this arcade, and I have this distinct memory of someone pressing the start button in the middle of the match and like changing their character. There was some glitched version of Street Fighter, and you can look this up online. I looked it up recently to make sure that I wasn't crazy, and apparently this was a thing that like there were glitched versions of Street Fighter out there where you could switch your character in the middle of a game by hitting the start button. So like, I played Street Fighter back in the day. I played every time my friends and I went to a movie theater. We always had to go to the arcade that was attached to it and see like if they had a Tekken machine or a Soul Calibur machine. But for me personally, I've always been a huge Marvel fan. Spider-Man is my favorite superhero.
Same.
I think, yeah, nice. Okay. I feel like Marvel's heroes are way better. I think DC typically has better villains, but like for the heroes, I've always been a huge Marvel fan. And so when Capcom started to make their series of Marvel fighters, X-Men Children of the Atom, Marvel superheroes, X-Men versus Street Fighter, and so on and so forth, like that was my shit. That was pretty much what I was interested in.
Love it.
And yeah, and now, I continued to play other stuff. I tried to play Third Strike and sucked at it. I tried to play Capcom versus SNK and was like reasonably okay at that. But like I was a fanboy, so I wanted to fanboy with my Marvel games. And when the FGC had this sort of renaissance in the late aughts into the early teens, whatever the fuck they're called. Marvel was the game that brought me in. So I was interested in Marvel 3. I was interested in watching, I was there for the Dark Wesker days. I was there for, oh God, what was his name? The guy with the soy sauce and the log trap. There was a Japanese player who came to the US for like a final round or something
Oh,
and
I don't know.
played like I think a Spencer Rocket Raccoon something else team and beat Combo Fiend, and everyone in the US was like crying about it, myself included. I think his name was something Joe. Anyway, so I was there for like the early Marvel stuff. And I was watching at the time. It was called Big Two, the tournament at Next Level in New York City, before it became Next Level Battle Circuit. So I used to watch Big Two all the time because they had a featured Marvel tournament there. And the other one of the Big Two tournaments was Street Fighter 4. And at the beginning, when I started watching, I loved Marvel, and every time the Street Fighter came on, I was like, I fucking hate this game. This game is boring. This sucks. And that's sort of where Maya is at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, that's exactly where she is. I think that's almost a direct quote, isn't it?
Yeah. And as time went on, I learned to appreciate it more. I got to watching more of Team Pie, who I really appreciated. A lot of people on the West Coast had a very interesting style. And then obviously I got to watch I started watching it at majors and not just at the locals, and that opened my eyes to a whole lot of stuff. And even now, like I really consider myself more of an all-around fan of fighting games. There's some that I like more than others, but I still like Marvel. I still like Street Fighter. I still watch Mortal Kombat and Tekken and all this other stuff. But for me personally, that moment of learning to like Street Fighter for me was like a moment of learning to appreciate fighter games at a deeper level. And so if I wanted to tell this story, that was sort of the place that I was going to approach it from.
All right. So we touched on this a little bit. You cover a lot of the classic FGC settings in this book. You've got your competitive Proving Ground arcade. You've got the MTA apartment with house tournaments and like a
Yep.
struggling capture card stream. And you've
Yes.
got your big regional that boils down to like a CEO style tournament.
Yeah.
Which one of these like meant the most to you personally? Like what were you the most satisfied with and did you feel the most like at home with when you were writing it?
So I think the one that I was most satisfied with was probably the tournament, because I think that it sort of built on a lot of stuff that I had established earlier, and then I've like I said, I've gotten a lot of good feedback from that. But even before I got the feedback, I was like, I think this is pretty accurate to what tournaments are like. Um, so from a purely like uh, from like the flavor of it, um, that's probably the one where I succeeded the most. The place that was the most challenging for sure was the apartment. Um, I had less to go on there because obviously you don't get the same level of visibility into people's apartments that you do into tournaments, which is for the best. I probably don't want to see that, and they probably don't want me seeing it, and that's fine. Um, uh, but also the because the apartment, the sort of dojo that she goes to is a personal space. Um, I felt like it really had to reflect the specific characters that I was building much more so than like the arcade didn't have to be a reflection of any characters. It's a business. The tournament didn't have to be a reflection of any characters. It was a tournament. Um, so yeah, I mean, from a writer's perspective, I'm most happy with the way that the dojo turned out because it was the biggest challenge for me. But from a reader's perspective, yeah, I think probably the tournament in New Jersey is the one that people will be sort of most happy with or most like they'll vibe with it the most.
In terms of the apartment, I don't know if this was intentional. I think you did yourself a service by adding the hotel room like salty suite tournament later
Yeah.
because it kind of let you get both perspectives, because with their apartment, like, it's their apartment, so like they're already there when the tournament starts and everything kind of forms around them, which is one vibe. But it's a completely different vibe to walk into a house tournament where it's like a place you've never been and there's just people everywhere, like smoking, drinking, playing games or whatever. And like you kind of got that perspective with the hotel room, so I think you balanced well there. All right, so I'm gonna read a passage real quick, and then I have a question to follow it up. So
yeah, sure.
This takes place at the regional tournament when she's wandering around looking at all the booths and stuff. So she saw a blind guy win his match to stave off elimination, and she saw another guy play with his mouth because his hands didn't work. She saw a skinny kid walking around with a blue fox tail pinned to the back of his pants, and a Korean player who got so pissed off about losing a round that he threw his shirt on the ground and played the rest of his match topless. So that right there, obviously some pretty clear FGC references that folks who know this stuff have been to tournaments, like, they'll recognize that, like, oh, Sonic Fox or whatever. But it also does a really good job of, like, rapidly painting a picture of what it's really like to walk around at a tournament, because they're diverse. There's a lot of people in different shapes, sizes, colors, doing different stuff. Like, it's a really accepting scene. When you wrote that, did you mean for it to be, like, the nod, or were you going for like just kind of laying out what this really feels like for people who might not be inducted to the FGC?
I mean, it's both, right? It has to be both. Like you can't tell people what it's really like to be a part of the FGC without paying homage to that kind of stuff. Because if you leave that out, to me, this is part of the thing about the FGC. Without those specific moments, it's hard for me to distinguish the FGC from like the pinball event that I went to or the anime convention that I went to. Like, I think people look at the FGC, to the extent that they look at it at all, people look at the FGC as though it's this really unique niche thing that you can't find any equivalent to anywhere else in the world. But like, that's true only because of the people who are in the FGC and the way that they express themselves in the community space. Like, there are lots of places that you can go that have flashing screens. We don't have a fucking monopoly on flashing screens. There are lots of places that you can go where people are like yelling and jumping up and down. Like, if you want people to yell and jump up and down, go to a concert. There are a lot of concerts where people yell and jump up and down. We don't have a monopoly on that either. There are anime conventions. We don't have a monopoly on being geeks about stuff, or like, wearing fucking ahegao shit that we shouldn't be wearing because it's gross, and then like making punny jokes about anime. Like, we don't have a monopoly on that. The thing that we have a monopoly on is that moment where you see somebody competing at something and also doing the weirdest shit you can possibly imagine them doing at that moment, where like, you will never see someone on a basketball court at a pickup game wearing like a furry suit. It's just not going to happen. I mean, like, it might somewhere in the world. I'm not saying that it has never happened anywhere on Earth, but like, I play a lot of pickup basketball. I ain't never seen that shit. There are a lot of people who play pickup basketball. I'm sure that most of them have never seen that shit. But if you're in the FGC, you see it. Like, right there, you can go to a lot of poker tournaments and see people competing. But if someone takes their shirt off because they're pissed at a poker tournament, I think there are probably rules about that. Whereas in the FGC, it's kind of like, well, I guess we're just gonna let it. Yeah. So like, so for me, it has to be both. There was no way that I could write this book in an honest and authentic and meaningful way and have it be about the FGC, but not include those kinds of nods to those moments that make the FGC unique.
I think you could even extend what you're saying there into esports. It's like, you don't see that stuff in Counter-Strike either. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah. And that's part of the thing too, that is really, again, like, if you want flashing screens, Counter-Strike has lots of flashing screens. They have, I'm sure they have their own fucking memes, and League of Legends has their own, like, whatever, like, in jokes they have in community, stuff. I'm sure they have their own people who do like cool commentary for them or whatever. But yeah, like, you watch their events and it has just a much more, corporate feel. It has a much more like the surface is just so much smoother, not just in terms of production, which I think is what a lot of people focus on when they say that, but like the individuals who are participating are have just a much smoother surface. And like we're not about that. Our surface is not smooth in the FGC. We are fucking bumpy, and buckle your seatbelt and try not to fall out of the window.
100%. Well said.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so this is a thing that impressed me. So coming up with your own gamer tag is a pain in the ass, and
Yeah.
to write this book,
Yeah.
you had to come up with what, like at least 20. So,
Yeah.
but overall, I would say that the tags you came up with, like, they feel pretty organic. Like I every tag, like,
Yeah.
I could feel like if I heard a TO yell that out at my local, I wouldn't like be like, "Wow, that's weird." Like they all felt like real gamer tags, you know. So
Yeah.
what was
Yeah.
the
Thank you.
process for coming up with them all individually, and like how'd you toe the line between like what was too cheesy or what was like too serious? Because you found that middle ground. So
Uh-huh.
like, what was the process for that?
Well, I'm glad that you feel that way. For people who follow my Twitter might know this. There is my tolerance for cheese is very high. Too cheesy for me is like borderline not a thing. So there are actually, I guess there's like three different ways that I came up with names to answer your actual question. So one of the ways that I came up with names is I didn't. There are a couple of characters in the book who are named after friends of mine, so they came up with their own names, and I asked them if I could use their handles in the book because those two friends were like the friends that I started playing fighting games with, and I wanted to sort of honor them and put them in the book that way. So I didn't come up with those; I just used them. Um, the second way that I came up with stuff is that for everyone in the dojo, in the house that Maya ends up in, I tried to come up with a name that meant multiple things. So to take the easiest example and the one that's least likely to be a spoiler for somebody, there's one of the players in this house of people that she gets involved with is goes by the name Intuit. So like in the root word of intuitive or intuition, and one of the meanings of that name is that he's a very intuitive player. He plays with his heart a lot. That's sort of the obvious surface level meaning of his name. And then the second meaning of his name is like into it, like INTO space IT, because in the same way that he's very that he's driven by his heart in his gaming, he's also that way just in general. He gets really into things. He's very passionate about things. He says what's on his mind, and so his name reflects both his play style and also something broader about his personality. So I tried to come up with names for all of them that had that sort of dual meaning, because again, I wanted the book to have layers, and I wanted people to have stuff that they could sort of sink their teeth into if they went back and read it a second time. Or even, so this is the other thing, I wanted people to be able to discuss this book and have one person be like, I noticed XYZ, and have another person be like, oh my god, I didn't notice that, but I noticed QXW or whatever. I'm bad at alphabets, apparently. Unfortunate handicap for a writer to have. But anyway, so the third way that I came up with names was puns, and that's probably what you were really getting at. And basically, what I tried to do for the puns was to actually, I guess there's a fourth way as well, but we'll get to that later. So what I tried to do with the puns was just to combine a fighting game thing with a non-fighting game thing. So like Apple Jacks is a good example. So the Apple Jacks is a cereal, right? People remember that from their childhood. It doesn't taste like apple, ha 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 commercials. But also Jax is a character in Mortal Kombat. So I was like, if you wanted to have like an easy FGC nickname, you could just call yourself Apple Jacks. Why not? Plus, also cereal is a big thing in the FGC for some reason. So
Serial tier lists and friendships.
yeah, right, yeah, yeah. Even worse than getting someone salty in the game is insulting their favorite cereal. That is a good way to get shanked in the FGC. But So like that's an example. So basically, yeah, I mean, I basically tried to do a fighting game thing and a non-fighting game thing. So another example is Saikyo origami. So there's a Saikyo Ryu, I think, is the name of the martial arts, the fake martial arts style that Dan Hibiki uses in Street Fighter. And then there's a rap group from, I think, Atlanta called Psyche Origami. So I was just like, I will combine those two things and make it Saikyo Origami because it sort of sounds the same. So really, it was, just puns. I wish I could say that I had some like, genius art thing that I did. No, it was just puns.
But like, it's worth pointing out that the ones you're naming for puns are
Yeah.
the stream monsters, which is exactly
Yes.
what
Yeah,
those
yeah,
names are. Like, these aren't the competitors. Like, your competitors have like these well thought out like great tags, and then you've got dudes sitting
yeah.
in stream
Yeah.
chats saying
Yeah.
stuff, and that's the punny ones, which I think is authentic. Like obviously they're goofy, but that's what it is. When you go on Twitch,
Yeah.
that's what you see. So
Yeah, yeah. And then the only other one that I can remember off the top of my head, the only other methodology that I use is there is one stream monster who has like a suggestive name, and that's oh no, wait, I guess that's not true. Sorry, this is like a category. So there are also stream monsters that have like themes, right? Where and that's another thing that you find in the FGC too. So Wake Up Show You is a stream monster who ends all of their statements with IDK question mark and then like a confused face. Gay Fetus is a stream monster whose shtick is using the action command to lick people in chat. I feel like there are others, but I can't remember who they are. There's got to be at least one more that I'm not remembering. So there's like gimmick accounts, and then there's also like people who have lewd names in stream chat. So the real life example was I think so back in the day there was this group called I think they might actually still exist called Empire Arcadia, and their tag that they put in front of everyone's name was EMP. So like Panda Global's PG and whatever else their tag was EMP. So there's this person in chat whose handle was EMP underscore jury feet, I think was the one.
oh boy.
Yep, yep. And you see that and you go, oh boy. So then there's a stream monster who's very obviously based off of that individual, because again, that's yeah. There is that type of person in the FGC, and I wanted to make sure this book was not just a excuse me a rose-colored depiction of the community. Like that's a real type of person that exists is in the FGC. So I used that person's screen name as an inspiration as well.
So you wrote Bodied before the big FGC Purge this
Yeah.
year, right?
Yes,
So
I sure did.
for those unaware, earlier this summer, a lot of figureheads in the FGC got outed for some sexual harassment in their past, and there was like kind of a wave of accusations that came out. So this novel is obviously written from the female perspective because Maya's your main character, and you do take plenty of shots at how women are treated in the FGC. But now that we're on the other side of this summer's controversies, if you had to revisit the book or like if you were writing it right now, would you kind of change your approach of that subject in some way? Is there something you would do differently, or do you think you did a like? Are you comfortable with the way you handled it? Do you think you touched it enough?
Yeah, well, I mean, enough is one. I mean, it's quantity versus quality, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that, yeah, I mean, I don't think there was a quantity issue. I think it's pretty unambiguous throughout the book that there's a problem in the FGC about the way that we treat women, and if you know anything about anything, you can sort of extend that to other vulnerable groups in society. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would change the quantity of stuff. The question is, would I make the instances of sexism in the book, would I make those more graphic or more like overtly criminal? Like, there's a lot of harassment in the book. There's not a whole lot of stuff that would rise necessarily to the level of like a legitimate crime. Um,
It's
and
generally verbal
so
abuse, correct?
yeah, 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 yeah. Um, I actually, when I was writing it, I considered having a moment where um, one of the like very minor characters that Maya sort of got into a spat with. I considered having him physically assault her and then having her get rescued by Intuit, who's a football player. So I figured he would be able to just like, knock somebody on their ass if he needed to. Um, and then for multiple reasons, it didn't end up working out. So I considered making it more graphic than it was initially, even before all this stuff came out. So, like, in a sense, I guess I'm not sure what I would have done differently. I think I certainly would have been tempted to make it more graphic and more explicit than I ended up making it. But again, I sort of had those plans already and they didn't work. And again, this is, you hear this a lot from, or I mean, if you listen to writers, then you hear it a lot from writers because writers tend to say this a lot. But it's true that as you are writing a story, you have these ideas of what it's going to look like and what you're going to do with it, and just sort of sometimes they don't work. Um, so I think it would have been a real challenge to do that with this book because introducing that level of brutality into things shifts, in my mind, shifts the sort of moral center of what's going on. Excuse me. So if there's just, so like you said, basically in the book it's just verbal harassment. It's mostly just shit talk that enters into territory that shit talk should never enter into. If it's when the problem only exists at that level, to me it's that's a gray line that's always going to be there. No matter how good the community gets, no matter how advanced society gets, there's always going to be the possibility that someone says something to you that hits you in a soft and vulnerable place. Currently in society, it's very easy for people to do that because of the systems of discrimination and oppression that exist. It's very easy for someone to just be like, I'm going to say something that's threatening in a way that mentions your sex or your gender, and all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, I actually like this brings back a lot of bad memories. This is associated in my mind with a lot of scary things or a lot of things that I think are, or not I think, a lot of things that are unfair and unjust. It's currently it's very easy to do that, and I think people might suspect like, well, if we just eliminated all of that stuff, then this would go away along with it. I don't think it's ever going to go away permanently. I think that there's always going to be some level of someone says something to you, and even if it's not related to your body, even if it's not related to your ethnicity or your background, even if it's not related to any social area or role that you occupy in your culture, there's always going to be something that someone says to you that crosses a line for you personally. So when the conflict is at that level, then to me, I'm more comfortable as a writer focusing primarily on the characters who are involved. And primarily, this book is a character-driven book rather than like a setting-driven book or something like that. If I had chosen, or if I hadn't been able to escape the feeling of being responsible for including events that were more graphic and more overtly criminal, then I think I would have had to shift a lot of other stuff about the book. I think at that point it would have been extremely dissatisfying to see that Maya sort of bears most of the weight of what's happening in the book, even with the ending being what it is. And without saying too much more about it, I guess I'll just say that in my head, I sort of anticipated people asking me, well, is this a happy ending or a sad ending? And my answer is going to be that it's a complicated ending. So even if the ending is still complicated, and doesn't, again, like I'm not trying to put rose-colored glasses on anything, even with all of that, I think that I still would have had to change a whole lot more about the book in order to make it not feel really shitty. Um, and so in order to write, and this, I think this is part of the reason why I cut that scene with my getting jumped by somebody, is that in order to write this book about this specific character going on this specific journey, I sort of had to I had to intervene on her behalf and make sure that she didn't experience the absolute worst of what was going on in the community. And as a writer, like I think to get to a question underneath the question that you're asking, as a writer, that is something that I struggled with and that I still struggle with. There's always to me this question of how much should you be saying, how much of this should you be trying to address. Like I do, obviously, if you read the book, I think it's pretty clear. I do feel like I have a moral obligation as a writer, that it's not just like I'm out here trying to, give you something that you can distract yourself from the real world and eat popcorn for a little bit and have fun. Like the book is a fun book, but I also want you to fucking think about shit. So I do feel like I have a moral responsibility as a writer. I do feel like I want my books to address that moral responsibility in some sort of constructive way. And so I do sort of struggle with this question of like, did I go far enough? If people read this book, are they going to come away with an overly optimistic idea of how bad things are in the FGC? But I'm hopeful that, and this is sort of the reason that I left it where it was, or that I allowed myself to leave it where it was, I guess is a better way of saying it. I'm hopeful that if you read this book and you recognize the symptoms of what's going on in here, then you will also recognize that there's probably more going on that I did not show you, and that therefore you will not be surprised or like, blindsided by things that are worse that are going on. Because like, ultimately, no matter how much I say in the book, there's always going to be something that I don't touch on. And so my goal was to say enough that people would recognize the pattern, but not so much that the pattern overwhelms the story that I was trying to tell.
Without giving anything away here, and if you
Mhm.
decide that we go into spoiler territory here, we can always cut this part out. But I have to ask.
Yeah,
So the ending of this book hit me like a truck. It caught me off guard. I was not prepared
uh-huh,
for it.
so to
Uh,
speak.
how early in writing the book did you decide how the story needed to end?
That was the start of everything, actually. So one of the huge inspirations for this book is an anime series called Katana Gatari, which is just all A's until the last one, which is an I. Um, which I find that most people haven't heard of. It didn't really blow up in the way that a lot of other ones did. I think largely that's because it's very talky. There are a lot of like really long dialogue scenes, and also the art style is kind of gimmicky. But if you can get over those two things, and if you are a fan of anime at all, so like Logan Sama, you can just ignore this. If you can get past the how wordy it is, and if you can get past the art style, Katana Gatari is superb. It's really good. Um, it's also about the concept of history and how people understand history, and how you understand your place within history. And it has a similar event that takes place late in the story. And when I watched that show for the first time, I had the same experience where when I got to that point in the story and the event happened that is similar to the ending of Bodied, I was I I mean I was speechless. I thought that they were going to undo it. So the thing happens at the end of an episode, and I was like, "Oh, they put it at the end of an episode just as a cliffhanger, and they're going to undo it in the next episode. Like the it's not going to be as bad as it seems." No, it was as bad as it seemed. And that moment of that story forced me as a viewer to reevaluate everything that had come before it. Up until that point, I was sure that I was watching one kind of show. It's very common to find an anime that's like that has the same characteristics that Katana Gatari has at the beginning for most of the show, where it's like kind of jokey and there's some action, and the action sort of ratchets up from episode to episode. You get your, what is it called on TV tropes, like ascending order of villainy or something like that. There's some trope for this. And it sort of builds up to this climactic fight at the end, and then there's your hero, he has to like fucking go Super Saiyan and surpass himself somehow, and blah 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 blah. Like it's a super common path for anime stories to take, and I was convinced that I was watching that show for most of the show, and then that thing happened, and I was like, oh, this is not that show. This is a different kind of show. I now have to figure out what kind of show this is. And that's the experience that I wanted people to have with Bodied. I wanted people to read the first, 300 whatever pages of it thinking, oh, yes, I know this story. This is this kind of story. And then to get to the, yes, and then to get to the ending and be like, oh, it's not that kind of story. Well, I guess now I have to go back and figure out what kind of story it is. And it just so happens that they are the same, roughly the same kind of story, Katana Gatari and Bodied. And there are also several other stories that are similar that I reference throughout the book. So Cowboy Bebop is actually pretty similar. Samurai Champloo is very similar. Again, two more anime that are sort of along the same lines. There's a Chinese movie called Hero starring Jet Li that came out several years ago that also is very similar, which if you haven't seen that, it's so fucking good. Oh my God, it's so good.
I'll add it to the list. I have not seen that one.
Yeah, it's really good. It's one of those like wuxia. If you'll forgive me for not knowing the tonal pronunciation of that, but so like Crouching, yeah, like Crouching Tiger, that same style of like highly dramatized like romantic martial arts stuff. Really beautiful, and then also again has this like that twist moment in it. Also, what's the other one that I referenced? Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai. An American movie by Jim Jarmusch starring Forrest Whitaker is another movie where you're like, that one is more artsy, so like there's less of a twist in there, but it's still the same type of ideas that I'm working with in this one. So it was important to me to end it that way because I felt like I needed to have a surprise factor to sort of like rattle people into looking at the book differently. The book, in addition to being about history, like we were talking about before, is about specifically the history of women in the FGC, and it's not a very pretty history. But I didn't want to address that subject again like I was just lecturing somebody. I didn't want to come out and just be like, abuse against women is bad. Don't say this to don't use gendered slurs against women in competition. Don't do XYZ. Like obviously I needed that stuff to be in there, but the communicating that message, I felt like I had to do that in a more artistic and more literary way instead of just being like, this is good, this is bad, the end. And so that was one of the ways that I tried to bring a little bit of artistry to that message. So yeah, like the whole structure of the book is based on that. The plot of the book inevitably has to end up there. I think if people read it multiple times, they'll see that it's like everything that I'm sort of like you said, there's a lot of foreshadowing that happens that has to lead there. Her personal growth as an individual in terms of her maturity, the way that story is told sort of has to end up there. Like the connection that it has with her mother's story, which is also part of the book, is such that it has to end up there. Like literally everything in the book, as much as I could do so, I tried to point everything towards that conclusion, because that conclusion was going to be the thing that sort of like made everything else in the book line up and form a coherent and meaningful pattern.
We've touched on this a good bit throughout, but FGC literature isn't something that is really broken through yet. I feel like it's just kind of starting to get legs now. We're branching out into that territory. Most books that exist right now are Daigo or Moment 37 centric. There are things that use the FGC as a set piece for like an unrelated plot, kind of like what High Score Girl does. But
Yeah.
you kind of, with this book, are pioneering fiction that is FGC centric and particularly American FGC centric. This is the first book that
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
does that. Are you are you satisfied with how you captured New York's FGC field? Do you think you did a good job getting the right amount in here?
I mean, I hope so. I mean, it wasn't really supposed to be like, I didn't really intend, again, it wasn't supposed to be like about New York per se. Like I needed a setting. You can't have the book take place nowhere. So I needed to put it somewhere. And in the time period that I was interested in, it was pretty much either going to be New York or LA, or, LA area. And I was most familiar with New York because I live in the Eastern time zone. And so, the New York streams are the ones that I had most access to. So like that was sort of just a excuse me, that was a choice of convenience more so than like here's what I want to represent. But like the American FGC, I mean, I hope um that I represent the American FGC as well as it can be represented by a single book. I mean, again, there's always going to be some diversity, there's always going to be some local flavor that I'm missing out on because I just didn't know about it, because it may not have existed even in 2011. That's the other thing about writing this book and publishing it when I did, is that it's already 9 years out of date. So like it's going to represent the FGC as sort of a compromise between now and 9 years ago. But yeah, like I think, not to sprain a shoulder patting myself on the back, but like yeah, I tried real hard to reflect as much of the FGC as I possibly could. I mean, there's a lot of like rap culture in there, because I feel like that's a very big part of the FGC. There's a lot of anime culture in there because I feel like that's a very big part of the FGC. I tried to throw in like pro wrestling stuff, like athletics is a big part of the FGC. I tried to throw that in there. I feel like the FGC is very philosophically minded, so I tried to throw a lot of that in there. And maybe more to the point, I tried my best to depict the FGC as primarily a community, where people meet one another and their relationships determine the course of events in that community. It is a community. Like we are first and foremost and above all else and fundamentally a community, which means that the relationships dictate almost everything. And that's what I was trying to focus on in the book, and I think and I hope that that's the message that gets across to people, because I think that a lot of other stories are set in those other types of environments. There are a lot of sports stories that are set, that focus on a person's skills. There are a lot of stories that are set in the corporate world that focus on like how shitty the corporate world is. There are a lot of stories about religion. There are a lot of stories about XYZ. In my experience as a reader, and I read a lot, it's very hard to find stories about communities. And so, if I was going to write this book at all, it had to be focused on the communal aspects of the FGC, and it had to communicate that reality to people, and not have them come away thinking that, that we're so focused on the screen that we don't notice one another. And so that's really the main thing that I was trying to communicate. And insofar as I did that, then yeah, I'm happy with it. Like it, again, if there's local flavor that's missing, or if people don't, if people don't see 100% of the fighting game stuff that they wanted to see or that they would have expected to see, then I'm okay with that, so long as they see 100% of the community stuff. Because that's what I was really trying to bring out from the FGC side.
Reed, thank you
Thank you.
so much for coming by today, talking about the book.
That's my pleasure.
Dude, it's just a great book. Anyone who plays fighting games, if you have not read Eli's book, Bodied, please go pick it up. It's seriously worth your time. It's a great look at the FGC. It's also just a great look at people in general. It's very solid. And you're supporting an FGC guy when you buy it and read it, so that's always nice too.
Yeah,
See, like you work with Top Tier, right?
that's correct. So yeah, in addition to the book, I have my Twitter account, which is just like jokes and shit, which is at Bodied Novel. I'm also a writer for toptier.gg, which is a fighting game community website. We do news and also a lot of just sort of interesting features about stuff. So we do a lot of profiles of community members. We also do a lot of sort of like psychological or sociological stuff about how fighting games operate. So we try to not just focus on, again, the like, frame data stuff, but to talk about like how can you within yourself identify the things that will make you a better fighting game player, which is I think is a pretty cool angle to take. I am also, this is sort of a long shot, but I am also one of the admins of a fighting game tournament organizer Discord. So if anyone out there is listening to this interview and is a tournament organizer and is not a part of the Discord, please contact me. So that you can be involved in that, because it's sort of a place where all of the different TOs can come together and talk about resources for stuff and share knowledge and not have to reinvent the fucking wheel every time someone wants to start a new event. Let me think if there's anything else that I'm involved with in the FGC. I think that's it. Oh, I've also like, there's a guy who does a fighting game based card game, which is kind of fun. I've helped him playtest stuff. So if you want me to help playtest stuff, I would be happy to do that, even if it's a digital game. Actually, I am a software QA professional by trade, so
That's
I would
awesome.
be, yeah, not just willing but able to help you test your early versions of your fighting game. So yeah, all kinds of fun FGC stuff.
Dude, I love it. Hands
Yeah.
in every aspect. That's the way to go.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, that's all I got for you today.
Cool.
Do you have any closing statements?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, follow me on Twitter at Bodied Novel. Please do buy the book. I would greatly appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, I have the standard writer's egotism. So yeah, anytime anyone wants to talk to me about the book, if there's like references that you think are there that you're not sure about, or like if there's a scene that is particularly interesting to you, or if you want to talk about the ending and rip my head off because the ending ruined your day, come find me. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about stuff.
Eli is very responsive on Twitter. That is how he got in touch. So if you want to bother him, go bother him there. He's responsive. All right, dude. Well, I'll let you go, man. Thanks for
Thanks,
taking
man.
the time, and hopefully talk again soon when Novel 2 is out in the world and I can read up on that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, of course, dude. Have a good one.
You too.